Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of comics like Wonder Woman Historia, The Amazons, Bitch Planet, Pretty Deadly, and more. It's Kelly Sue DeConnick. Thanks for coming on, Kelly Sue.
Thank you for having me.
How's your Tuesday treating you so far?
Okay. Went over and walked my dad's dogs and came back and did a little gardening, which all makes it sound like I have nothing else to do today. But no, I have a million more pressing things to do. But the dogs had to be walked, and I had some petunias that I needed to get planted or the sun was going to burn them up. So
oh, boy. Is it pretty spicy in Portland today?
No, today is actually quite lovely. But the last 2 days have been pretty laser focused hot. And I wanted to, make sure things that were sitting in trays with like 2 inches of soil were not going to go poof.
I think it's funny. I think sometimes that when readers or when people who are not super familiar with like what a creator's life is like, they just think that basically it's like 9 to 5, you just sit at a desk and you just write continuously. One of the things that always kind of surprised, well, it doesn't really surprise me at this point. I've been interviewing people for so long. So much of the day of an average comic creator is dealing with things that have nothing to do with making comics. And it's not just like, petunias and walking dogs and things like that, but it's like interviews or responding to emails or just kind of managing your existence. I don't know. It's kind of interesting how there's all this stuff that like just kind of takes away from your writing brain space or from your time writing that you can plan for, but it definitely makes your ability to just sit down and write in a chunk pretty difficult.
Yeah, yesterday I had 0 writing time and I was furious because I have a couple things that are on fire right now. But I also, there was nothing there that I could let go that didn't need to be handled. It was all things that, needed to be handled. I don't know. It is what it is. I do try to take some time consciously for myself to do like some baking or some sewing or to have some hobbies, which I used to not do. But right now I'm in my 50s and I have both children and parents that need care. And so I'm in that like sandwich generation segment. And it also happens to be timed with a really peak moment in my career. And so my stress level is kind of through the roof. So in order to manage all of that, I have kind of decided that, no, I'm going to work out and I'm going to have some things that I do just for me. And I don't get to do it every day, but at least a couple times a week. I try to make sure I get the working out in every day, but, I'll only get to like sew or bake or whatever goofy thing it is that I want to do. Wow. A couple times a week, but a couple times a week, I'll insist on it no matter what else is on fire.
Didn't you make a strawberry shortcake earlier this week?
I made not a strawberry shortcake, it was a lemon zest strawberry cake.
Oh my God. It looks so good.
And it was funny. It was good. We ate some last night, but I just wanted to make it. It wasn't even about, I was just like the process. I like the smells. David Lopez was like, he's like, how do you make that and not eat it right away? And I was like, I don't know that I need to eat it at all. Actually, I hope it gets eaten because then it feels wasteful. But I don't have a huge sweet tooth. And actually sugar tends to make me feel like garbage. I don't eat a whole lot of sugar, but I did have a little piece last night though. I
find that my wife actually brought this up this past week. We made a very like simple dinner of just like grilled chicken with baked potatoes and like, I'm trying to remember what else. I think it was just broccoli and it was very simple. I was like, oh, this is really good. I was like, why don't we make this more often? And she's like, you always want to make very complex meals. And I think for me, part of the process of cooking really complex meals is I'm doing something that if I actually follow the instructions, I know it's going to turn out right and it's going to feel really good. And at the end, I get to eat something that I really like. And, sure, is the process of cooking some sort of elaborate miso egg udon dish going to be really complex? I'm like, sure. But I think it's actually good for us to just have something to kind of shut our brains down and just like enjoy the process for a bit.
A million times, yes. And also there's when you're day job, is it's squishy,
Hmm.
right? Like, is this script better than that script? Have I done well? Is it like I can evaluate it for myself, but someone else can have an entirely different opinion. Like it's squishy is the best word that I have for it. So I tend to like things like baking. Baking is not, you don't make it up as you're going, right? Like Elisa Bendis is a cook, right? She's like riffs. Baking is chemistry.
Hmm.
I do it all by weight. It's all very exacting. And as you say, like if you do it exactly right, it's going to come out exactly right. And I feel that way about sewing too. It's in 3 dimensions. There's no like, well, maybe this scene does what it's supposed to do. It's, does that line up without any creases? Yes, it does. Like it's an angle or it's not an angle. My husband does woodworking, right? And he's like, is that flush or not flush? There's no subjectivity to it. I feel that way about weightlifting too. I love weightlifting because am I making progress? Yes, I am. When I try my hardest, I can lift 20 pounds more than I used to be able to lift when I tried my hardest. It's not something you can dismiss or talk yourself out of or doubt. So I like, even in creative things that I do in my spare time, I like them to be things that are more easily evaluated objectively.
Hmm. Weightlifting is an interesting one because I don't know if I'll be the first person to compare weightlifting and baking, but it's one of those things where if you don't if you don't have your form right, you're gonna hurt yourself. And so
Yeah.
it's like you got to have that chemistry done right, otherwise your squat is going to result in some serious back pain.
Yeah, yeah. And I I have a trainer and I have a little checklist for every lift and like, okay, are my are my legs screwed into the ground, which is how we think of it, right? For
Yeah.
squats, like are my legs rotated inward or that's not exactly right, but whatever. And is my core tight? Is like you check everything and like yeah, yeah, and then you get it off the ground or you don't.
It's interesting to think about that because it's like you're talking about the squishiness of writing. One of the things I think is also interesting is making comics in a lot of ways. Your part is squishy, but then on top of that, you also have to hand it off to somebody else who will modify it. It's like you have like additional chefs in the kitchen,
Right.
and you have to hand something off that's squishy enough that your collaborators can make something extra delicious out of it. Like, one thing I really enjoyed about the back of Wonder Woman Historia, the Amazon's hardcover, is there's all the sections with the artists. And in Gene Ha's section, there's the part in the script where you said the script that follows should be considered more of a roadmap than a set of blueprints.
Yes.
And Gene found that at the very least to be an invite to go nuts, which he really liked. But I do think that's interesting because it's kind of the opposite. It's like an extra added challenge versus the difference between that and like baking is that it's a squishy experience that at some point you're gonna have to let go and just see what they come up with.
Yeah. And I think that isn't something I lament, even though it sounds as though I do because I talk about wanting to balance that out in my free time. I mean, if I wanted to be a god, I could be, like, right? Like I would write novels and then I would control everything.
Right.
But I love the collaborative process. And every one of my scripts has that letter at the start. I mean, I go through and rewrite the letter for the particular collaborator, but the paragraph about, this is to be considered a roadmap and not a set of blueprints is that is a metaphor that I go back to again and again because I think if you are so prescriptive that you essentially have some image in your brain that you want that artist to act as your pencil and execute on your grand vision, you should fucking learn to draw.
Right.
Like you are not collaborating, you are dictating. If you want to have a creative partnership with this person, you need to give them space to be creative. The piece is a conversation. It is a dialogue. I personally think if you are working in this model and you think it is a monologue, you are doing it wrong.
Right.
Just my FYI. Like,
Well, yeah. I mean, like one other line you had in that write up I thought was super valuable too, because you said, I'm around if you want to talk about anything.
yeah,
Because it's an open door policy. It's not like an edict. You're not like ruling with an iron fist. You're like, Gene, if you need to talk about something, or Nicola, you need to talk about something, or Phil, you need to talk about something, or Emma, you need to talk about something. You know that if you give them the freedom to do their jobs as well as humanly possible, they'll come to you if they need something. But at the same time, like that's collaboration, it's
yeah,
communication, it's engaging, and it's giving each other the freedoms to do your job as well as you possibly can, because that's your job.
yeah. And often it's like, oh, I have this idea, actually, that what if we changed this into this thing, but I want to run it by you because I don't want to mess up anything that you have going. And like, oh yeah, no, if that's exciting to you, we're going to make it work, because I really do feel like they're relationships. Which is like, I won't write a script if I don't know who I'm writing for. I think that's stupid. And there are a lot of comics companies that would like you to write the script, and then they'll match you with someone, and like I can't do that. It's a letter. It's an epistolary model. It's I want to tailor the story to their strengths and their interests, so that we get the best work out of the partnership. So there's something just really cold. And I guess it would be interesting as an experiment. Like, I could see doing some kind of blind something, writing a script for someone you didn't know that who you were writing for. But then I would want to do something more interesting, some kind of exquisite corpse something with that, to make that more interesting than just, I have a generic story, please interpret it.
Well, and it's also interesting to like look at Wonder Woman Historia itself is like a fascinating study on just how different artists can actually bring a story to life. There are similarities in storytelling, but there are things like, one thing I shared on Blue Sky, which you reshared, was there's this 4-panel sequence in the third issue that Nicola does, where it's a conversation between Hera and Dionysus, and it's a conversation between the two of them, and it's 4 panels that are very narrow, that are just incredible character acting demonstrations in really small space. And like that stuff, Phil is incredible and Gina is incredible, but I don't know if like that speaks to their strength as much as it does Nicola's. And I think that Nicola being able to kind of find the right answer for that, and you working with knowing Nicola's strengths, like that sequence might have turned out differently if you didn't know it was Nicola drawing that to begin with.
Yeah, and I mean, she did some really big bombastic pieces in her book. The Heracles spread is just jaw-dropping.
The scale is insane.
But the page that kills me is actually in and I'm this is radio, so it's great that I'm reaching for my
I do this all the time.
Book, but the page that is probably my favorite of hers it's a battle scene, so it is a bombastic sequence, but after Katya has died, when Hippolyta just loses it,
Mm-hmm.
and all of that grief is taken out in this just physical, it's the battle equivalent of screaming.
Yeah.
It's just she's hurting so badly. The sequence is so strong, and I of course cannot find it, and it's making me insane here, but the sequence is so strong that I wanted it silent. I wanted to take all the words off of it, because it was just more than here we go. All right. We of course don't have page numbers, so there's but here, this is what it looks like.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So if we can describe for readers, or for listeners, sorry, you guys, I'm having a day. It is a 5-panel page. It's and it would be an odd numbered page, it's a right facing page. And on the top left is the line, "War is simple." The dialogue is captions. This is, "War is simple. It is not pure or clean, but there is a structure to it. There are calculations, goals, rules even. Absent those necessary fictions, a warrior will lose her way. She'll lose herself. She will become rage." It's absolutely beautiful what she's done here, because she's contrasting we never want to tell a comic book reader what they're looking at, right? We
Right.
don't want to use both channels to provide the same information. So what we're looking at in those top 4 panels, so it's 4 vertical panels on the top of the page, and it is Hippolyta kind of berserking in the Viking sense. But what we're reading is about cleanliness and control, and war is this, it is an art, this is the idea. And what you're looking at is the opposite, as you see her kind of losing her grasp on that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final panel, which is probably a little more than a third of the page, is her then on her knees in the midst of all of these fallen soldiers around her. And you realize that, unfortunately, I'm almost telling you what you're looking at, but she has given herself over to the pain. But the acting in this moment, how lost she is in her eyes, Nicola did that so beautifully. I didn't need to play games of contrast here to get across what we needed to get across. This was almost too much. I ended up leaving it because I was afraid, without words to make you stop on those panels, you would take that sequence in too quickly.
Yeah.
And so we added it or didn't add it, but rather we did not cut it in order to make sure that your eyes really lingered over the work that she'd done there.
I do think that's one of the interesting things that people forget about when it comes to comic writing, but also I think you did a particularly good job on this series is scripting can be used as pacing in the way that you sequence it in panels. And you're getting readers to slow down by getting them to look at it more, by getting them to read. And when they do that, they either knowingly or unknowingly are taking in the art to a greater degree because of it. And that changes the pacing, and that changes how we engage with it. And it is interesting how much of writing and art separately and together in comics is really about kind of controlling pace and kind of controlling the reader and how they engage with it in that sort of way.
Yeah, there was only one time that Phil and I ever disagreed that I can think of. And I make a deal with all of the artists that I collaborate with that there's no hierarchy here. So if we have a disagreement about something, we're going to first try to work it out in a compromise. And if there's not a compromise that works, then we're going to decide based on, does it fall into the art? If it falls into the visuals, it's the artist's call. And if it falls into the verbal, which I include lettering in, which is a little hard because everything about the story is visual, right? Then it's my call. Everyone I've ever worked with, that's been the agreement. And it almost never comes down to well, that's your call, or, well, that's my call, And also, if it's a coloring issue, unless it's something that was in the script, that's for the artist. And if it's a lettering thing, unless there's a really strong please don't put that balloon there because that messes up my cup, then I work closely with the letterer and the artist works closely with the colorist. But there was one spread where Phil and I had a disagreement, and understand that he's one of my best friends in the world now. We're done with our issue together, and for a long time now, and yet we still have a standing Wednesday morning phone call. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite humans. So this is not well, Phil and I had it out. But Philip's no, this was one time where it was no, he really wanted it this way, and I really wanted it this other way. And so it was this spread right here.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of this crazy part where the goddesses are all giving their gifts to the slurry from which the Amazons will rise. And he really wanted it to have this kind of crazy, you're taking it all in at once feeling. Almost the madness of looking upon a god, right? Which I totally love that. But it was but here's the thing. You can't take in language like that. It has to be linear. And when they turn the page, they're going to have this experience of whoa, But then they're going to look for, how do I take in these these balloons? How do I consume the language? And if we make them fight too hard for what order to do this in, we'll lose them.
Right.
And so it has to feel somewhat effortless. So whatever we can do to help guide their eyes so they know at least, if not which cluster to read first, what clusters are clusters, right? So if you're not sure whether you're reading Athena or Hecate's clusters first, you still do have to understand that the Hecate lines all go together and the Athena lines all go together. And so it was hard because he had one particular thing that he was going for. And I was like, I get it. And I love that idea. And that is just not how language works.
Right. Yeah.
But, so it came down to a compromise where it is this crazy thing. And we did space the balloons out a bit, but we clustered some a little bit more than would have been his preference so that the reading order was a little more clear.
There's always an interesting push and pull between that sort of thing. Weirdly, in completely different medium, in a classic unnecessary pop culture comparison, but it kind of reminds me of Christopher Nolan, who loves in his movies to have sound at a level that increases like the verisimilitude of what the experience would be like. And sometimes it drowns out dialogue.
Right.
And it makes it harder for you to interpret. And it is a really cool creative decision that makes it harder to watch his movies sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's funny how like I see you see them. I mean, you see the merits of both sides and I see the merits of both sides. But I do want to talk about the collaboration part because, Wonder Woman Historia is not your first project. You've been doing this for a while. Even, your original background, you went to the University of Texas at Austin and got a degree in drama, which is another medium in which you would write something and then you would hand off to production designers, you would hand off to actors, you would hand off to a billion other people to bring something to life like you did with Awakening at the Wynn Las Vegas right now.
Yeah.
At a certain point, that stuff is out of your hands. Did you have to learn to be able to do that? Like, was that something you had to kind of train yourself out of, like, this is not mine anymore. This is the artist. This is, so-and-so's on the drama side. Or was that something you kind of took to naturally because you liked those mediums to begin with as a storyteller?
I love the collaborative process. If I'm paired with someone that we have a chemistry and a trust, I love it. That is the joy of making things for me. And so that was not something I've had to learn, not in comics, but in stage and television. The longer I'm working in those, the more I'm finding that I may have an urge for more control that I didn't think that I had. Like, I never saw myself as somebody who wanted to direct. That was always very much like Matt's path, not mine. But there are parts of me now that are like, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure about it though, because I'm not the world's best manager. I tend to adopt people rather than hire them. And I don't know. I'm not certain it's a great fit, but in my 50s with 20, 30 years of some of this stuff under my belt now, there are some times where I'm like, I don't want to convince you of this. I just want to do it.
Yeah.
Believe me, I know, been through it, tried it. This is my preference. So there's a little bit of that creeping in. And maybe that's just I'm tired. I don't know. And maybe that's working in television where there's a lot of like justifying what seems like really, really obvious. Like, really? That is the question you have? Yeah, right now I'm on strike, but prior to that, I've been very lucky for the last few years that I've been working with a particular television executive that I love, which is a thing you cannot say about a lot of people.
Right.
Which is unfortunate. I don't want to be like that, but I've like had some just jaw-dropping experiences. I literally had someone say to me once, "Can we give her a boyfriend or a child so I have a reason to care about her?"
Wow.
That was a thing that a human being said out loud to me, by the way, which was like, did you read the package? Like, yeah. So So some of that stuff has happened, and you're just like, I spent 45 minutes on the phone trying to convince a producer that I loved, but it was just like, no, this woman's name has to be mentioned in this conversation. And it's, I don't want to get into too many of the details, but it was just like, well, I don't want to make it political. It's like, it's not political. It's just human.
I'm curious as to the interest in that side. It seems like, with comics, you don't want that control because it's collaborative. It's a small team. You kind of know that you can trust like Emma, or you can trust Phil, or you can trust whomever to do that. It seems like the things that are really coming in is when it's, I'm not trying to put you on the spot with things that might get you in trouble, but with like TV or with even like with stage, it's like sometimes I imagine a lot of the feedback comes from people who are not necessarily creatives by nature, that are not necessarily asking creative centric questions.
Yeah.
Is that kind of where the desire for that control comes from? Because then you can kind of not extricate yourself from it, but you can kind of give yourself the power necessary to be able to say no and actually be able to make that stand.
Yeah, that may be it. And I've been very lucky in comics. A lot of people imagine that comic book editors are trying to play everything safe. And that's actually not the case at all in my experience. I mean, I've been told no a couple of times, but for the most part, it comes down to money, and making comic books is real cheap, you guys. Is a very, very, very inexpensive process compared to television, film. So they're not terrifically risk averse. In fact, I would say they are getting more risk averse as these comic publishers that, we were like, oh, the big two, right? And like DC Comics and Marvel Comics are big in our industry, but for what they cost to make their products, they're not big. Like this is all chump change, y'all. And so it's interesting to me though, because as like Marvel has become Disney and as DC has become Warner, Comcast or AT&T or whoever the hell they are now, I think the people who did the buying don't quite understand. And look, I don't have an MBA, so maybe I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. But my perception is I don't think they understand what they bought. I think they think that they bought IP and that that's where the value is. And I've tried to have this conversation before, and I've been, the value's in the creators. Nope, value's not in the creators either, because we have incredibly talented creators in all these different industries. The value is in the fact that comics are cheap and fast. We have a built-in audience. We're the best test kitchen you could possibly have for not just this like IP that we've had for 70 years, but for creating new IP, for creating new ways of telling stories. We break story, and I don't mean break down like outline in the way we talk about, I'm going to break episode 3 or I'm going to break issue 7 or whatever it is. I mean, breaking 3-act structure, breaking first person narration, breaking whatever expectations that you have. We do that better than anybody else. We do so many things better than anybody else. And we cost like a quarter. And, and like you could double our pay, which you should, by the way. And it would still be cheap for the R&D that these people are getting. And so, and when they decide instead, oh no, what we need to do is protect the existing IP rather than fostering new stuff or fostering creative uses of the existing, I think that's where it gets dumb and dangerous. Like, you're gonna kill the golden goose that you just bought.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Con season is among us, and the excitement can be felt on Zoop. July continues the fully funded Stardust, the Super Wizard anthology featuring an all-star creator lineup including Mike Allred, Francesco Francavilla, Jeff Parker, Pete Woods, and more. The fully funded La Bornquena, Volume 1 hardcover from Edgardo Miranda Rodriguez, as well as new projects from Glenn Bray, Paul Allore, Stack Deck Press, Tripwire Magazine, and coming later this year, Howard Chaykin's first foray into crowdfunding. It takes less than 30 seconds to sign up, and the e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. And of course, the creators appreciate your support. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show. I mean, I do think it's interesting. Like, what you're talking about is basically before comics were just created and they created stories and then they would feed into the system because they have great stories to tell that can be used by these other things. Now it's kind of gotten to the point where it kind of reciprocates to some degree, where the comics are kind of reflecting what's happening in the movies, and that's creating a situation where it's going to make them more difficult to actually be useful in that regard. It's funny. Do you know who Francois Hercouet is? He's the editor-in-chief of France's Urban Comics that does DC
I listened
stuff.
to your interview with him last night.
Oh, okay. Well, so Francois, we actually, funnily enough, we talked about the test kitchen idea in that very podcast.
And I think that's probably, literally, by the way, I've never used that phrase before. I think I've always talked about it as R&D.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But the thing that I thought was a really good point from him was that Black Label is particularly appealing in this regard in like the, creating the feeder system, if such a thing exists, of like really great stories you can keep building on, because like, look at, just Wonder Woman alone. You have Wonder Woman Historia, your story with Phil and with Nicola and with and Jean, amongst others. But then you also have something like Daniel Warren Johnson's Wonder Woman Dead Earth. Two completely different flavors of stories that both speak to the nature of the character, that can have a life outside of just that, but also are, as he said, and as retailers have said to me, will be evergreen sellers forever. Right. Because they're one and done stories you can just read and you can just enjoy. Yeah. And it is interesting how that type of idea, the kind of bread and butter for comics for like 80 years, is not as universal of a draw as it used to be.
There's so much there. Like, there's a couple different separate conversations, right? Like,
sure.
Ideally, like, I don't want us to be a feeder system.
Of course.
But,
yes.
And I understand that you don't either, but I just, feel it's necessary to like state. But if we are in the situation that we are in, where corporations buy up smaller corporations and, it is what it is, then I think it's important that the people who bought the two biggest publishers in comics understand what they bought, right?
Yeah.
See where the value is so they don't kill it.
And be willing to take risks.
Yes. I think they should be willing to lose money, because that's what R&D does, right? Not every area of your business has to be profitable. Take what we do best and really use it, really go nuts. So that's one aspect of it, is this like, well, I don't want us to be a feeder system, but if we are going to be a feeder system, at least in those two companies, then let's use this well. Let's understand what it is that you've purchased. And then the evergreen thing, or the standalone thing, we seem to have this push and pull in our industry between the serial experience, and you can enjoy this stuff without it being a lifestyle. Mm-hmm. Like, it's okay if you read shared universe corporate comics the same way that you read a murder mystery novel. It's okay to have people who are not trying to build one storyline that they've been reading since they were 12. Mm-hmm. There's no shame for the lifestylers. Like, that's fantastic, but there's room for both. And I don't know why we have this kind of push and pull. That's really interesting to me. And I don't know if it comes from just like any small group is going to divide into factions and turn against it, like, I don't know what that is about, but I find that when it's like people are like manga readers or when people are talking about the biggest comic book writers and somehow Raina Telgemeier doesn't get mentioned, because those aren't quote unquote real comics. Like, what? You're insane. She shut down the New York Times bestseller list, you guys.
Oh my God. She was just in Alaska, and it was like if the Beatles came here. Like, they were busing in kids to this high school auditorium, bus after bus just to make sure that they could fulfill the demand. And even then, they couldn't put any more people in because of fire code. It was insane. It's really fascinating. That stuff always really does fascinate me too, because, it's like there's always like manga versus comic or graphic novel comparisons, or like, all ages comics versus like direct market comics and all this stuff like that. They're all comics.
Yes.
I mean, it's like they're fundamentally all sequential art. Some go, right to left, some go left to right, some are aimed at different demographics, and that's all good. They're all good. But, I did want to bring up one comic from your career that I think is an interesting one, especially considering the fact that I don't think that it's something you get talked about a lot. Actually, I have to comment. I would say I read a lot of interviews with you, and I would say like 85% of the interviews with you, or maybe more, are about Captain Marvel, which is understandable, but also kind of a staggering number.
Yeah.
The project I want to bring up actually was Osborn. And the reason why I wanted to bring it up was 3 different levels. One, it was the first project you did for, the big 2 that was not a one shot. It was a 5-issue miniseries, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
It was also one of those books that you only really get if you're not risk averse, because it was definitely not your typical Marvel comic in a very good way. And 3, the reason why it's probably the most consequential for you in your career is it was the first time you worked with your future partner in crime on Pretty Deadly, Emma Rios.
Right.
I kind of feel like that's an underrated, important moment in your career that gets slept on a lot. It's interesting. I don't really see it come up a lot, but it feels like it was kind of a consequential moment for you.
Yeah. And there's a few things about it. It's, as I go back and evaluate my own work, you do a lot of research. You probably heard me tell this story before, but I am going into the third of my career. I'm 52 years old. I will not be able to write indefinitely, right? At some point, it will stop. And so I'm very conscientious about what I choose to do now. We always have a limited number of projects in us, but you don't really start to feel that until you realize something like, oh, I am beginning the end, right? And that's not fatalistic or depressing from my perspective. It simply is. It's just reality. And so I want to be mindful of these things. I want to look back. I want to have learned from what I've done. And when I go back and look at my work, I think my earliest work is characterized by a kind of inventiveness that comes from not knowing the rules, right? But it's also, the craft is not great. So I love Osborn. I'm very proud of Osborn. The pacing in Osborn is atrocious, as is the pacing in the first Pretty Deadly collection. I haven't learned how to handle that yet. And it's still something I struggle with, but it's something I've gotten much better about. I can see that progress as easily as I can tell the difference in lifting weights. I have enough perspective on it now to see that no. In fact, that was quite rushed, that ending. And I have gotten better about that. In the second third of my career, which would be a lot of the Captain Marvel work, I was really focused on craft and really learning my chops. Didn't take as many chances. It's safer work, but it's craft-wise, some of it. You can tell I'm making decisions like I felt I had gotten reliant on internal monologues for Carol in particular. It was something I knew I could do well, and I would write things that I knew were helping me land moments. And I got to the point where I consciously decided not to do that anymore, because I felt like it was becoming a crutch. It was becoming something that really characterized my work in a way that I felt was limiting. Like I was becoming that guy in your high school that wears the fedora, like, oh, that's her thing, and bless him, that's fine. But there comes a point when you don't want to be the guy that wears the fedora anymore. Right. And so that was the second third, was really getting my craft chops down and learning how to tailor my scripts for the strengths of my writers, my partners, my artist partners, and learning to evaluate their strengths, right? Because I ask them too, like, what do you like to draw? What do you not like to draw? And then I look at their work and sort of, sometimes we'll see things that maybe are not things that they've mentioned to me, but maybe things that they're not conscious of. We all have that. For like, somebody wrote a paper on my work that like I have ocular trauma in like tons of my work. They're absolutely right. And it's not a conscious decision. And I have no history of ocular trauma. I don't know where it comes from. But everybody has that thing, right? We have our little tics, and we have a little bit of a mirror blindness that we can't see it. But going into the third, what I felt was, oh, I want to be deliberate in this point in my life about allowing for the same specificity of voice that I had in the earlier parts of my career, married with the craft that I worked on in that second part. Like, I'd like to see if in bringing this home, I can bring those two parts of the creative experience together. And so that's what I'm hoping to do.
I'm going to take us in a direction that may be self-destructive, so I apologize in advance. I have a perspective on your career and kind of what Wonder Woman Historia kind of represents for you.
I'm fascinated.
I hope that this is not the wrong direction. I will put out the caveat that I very much like your work. Like, I think Bitch Planet is great. Valentine is not only a great artist, but also a great person. I had dinner with him and Lauren Sankovic and some of your other crew at Emerald City a few years ago. And like, just maybe even better person than he is an artist, which is really saying something. But here's my take.
Yeah.
I think that I could feel you wanting your books to be something before Wonder Woman Historia versus Wonder Woman Historia. I feel like maybe because you had more time, maybe because it was allowed space in a way that others aren't. But I feel like in that one, instead of wanting it to be something, you just let it be what it needed to be.
Oh, interesting.
And it's interesting because it feels so natural, and it feels so, it's like you were telling a story with your collaborators, a story that always existed. We just didn't know it until then. And it's interesting because it has this very naturalistic feel that maybe some of your earlier work didn't. Your earlier work, again, I want to say is good, but it is interesting how that it feels like that third, you kind of really, I don't want to say be all Maslow and say that you've reached like self-actualization or something like that, but it feels like you hit a level where you're incredibly confident and comfortable with where you want stories to go, and it just is what it is.
Yeah. I guess it'll be interesting to see what happens now. Pretty Deadly's coming back. Bitch Planet is coming back. And I have another creator-owned book that I just signed the contract on day before yesterday. So it'll be interesting to see if the confidence and, I mean, I want to use the word ease, but history wasn't easy. I mean, it wasn't.
No, none of it seems like it should have been easy. It seems like it should have been incredibly difficult.
No, and I don't mean to, David, I'm so hard to offend. I promise you.
Oh, no, I get it. I'm
very comfortable being someone who is on a trajectory. I agree with you. I like, there's nothing in my early, well, that's not true. There's one issue of mine that I twitch and anytime anybody asks me to sign it. But for the most part, I have a fondness for all of my old work, even though I can see its flaws. And, sometimes I can understand too, like, well, I'd rather we took a swing that I don't think quite landed than have played it safe. Like a million times, I would rather have taken chances. So no regrets. It is what it is. But that doesn't mean that you can't be like, oh, right here, here's where we're learning and here's where we're going. And there is something about that I completely understand about Historia, that even though it's in this like very elevated voice, it feels comfortable. The idea was we're Antiope is sitting down with a young Amazon, teaching her the history of her people. Mm-hmm. And so the voice goes back and forth between memory and kind of instructive voice for someone who's a little bit younger, that you want to be engaged and in love with this history, right? It's a celebration. And so there's an ease and a gentleness to it that even in its angriest moments, because it's told like, this is a history, this is something that happened a very long time ago. right? So it doesn't feel as angry as Bitch Planet feels because there's a distance. So I'll be interested to see if, I mean, not that I have a problem with angry, but I'll be interested to see if when these other books come back, how do I feel an evolution on my side of it? Or do I feel like we're just picking up where we left off?
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. It's Bad Idea, and Bad Idea is once again doing something? They're telling you that only you can save digital comics from Amazon, as the Renegade publisher is kickstarting a new digital comic from David and Maria Lapham, Scorpio Steele, Bill Crabtree, and Dave Sharp called The Ends. They're describing it as a quote-unquote comic book masterpiece, with the whole endeavor even coming with a pro edition featuring work from other creators. Wait, Bad Idea is doing digital? I thought that wasn't their thing. You might be wondering. You were correct. But apparently, you are no longer so. The Ends is coming to Kickstarter, but also digital at some point in the future. Sounds like a bad idea. It also sounds like Bad Idea. We'll see what it entails when it hits, but Bad Idea, doing its thing on Kickstarter once again. And now, back to the show. Well, one thing that I think is interesting about that is you specifically pointed to one volume of Pretty Deadly not feeling paced right. So, which insinuates the next two do feel paced right. I mean, it seems like you can, you already walked us through a 3-phase evolution of your career, but it seems like you already can see that.
Yeah.
And so, I imagine that you, at the very least, you'll probably feel it as you're doing it. It seems like, reading your pitch and reading kind of your process as a storyteller, it seems like you respond to what the story is giving you and what you think is necessary with it. Like with in the pitch document, or at least the write-up of the pitch document in the back of Wonder Woman Historia.
That is legitimately the pitch document.
I want to say I love the P.T. Barnum stuff. You commented on the fact that people need to be ready for it. I loved it. I thought it was great. You got to sell it. I mean, that's what a pitch document is. It's a sales document. But the thing is you said that there will be a couple things in there that don't make it into the final story. And because when you got into it, you realized that those were not the right answers anymore, that those were not the path you actually wanted to take once you're actually scripting it and getting into it.
Yeah.
And it seems like, one way or another, it's like like with Pretty Deadly, the first volume, when you go through that, you're like, maybe a little bit later you realize that it didn't pace right. So the next one, you make that a focus and you kind of like fine tune that a little bit. And it's always growing and you're always growing. And I mean, isn't that the goal for us as humans and storytellers?
It absolutely is. And Pretty Deadly in particular, it's interesting that like the first volume of that, I loved. At the time, I couldn't see the pacing issues with it.
Sure.
It wasn't until I reread it later that I was like, ouch, But I loved that book. I loved that book, even for its flaws. But there was this whole kerfuffle when it came out. I don't know if you remember.
The retailer thing?
Yeah. And
yeah.
A dude for whom literally Transformers comics are like peak comics was saying that this book was the worst comic that he'd ever read and deliberately obtuse. And it was like mean spirited and angry and it was such a bummer because this was a book that was like a Western, by a weird Western at that, by like 2 women creators that hadn't been at it that long. And we did 3 times the sales numbers that my like number I wouldn't say out loud because I didn't want anyone to know that I had that kind of ambition. We tripled it, and we only got to enjoy that for about a day and a half before this guy pulled this whole stunt. And it was painful and I was mad. Oh, I was so angry. And I tried not to let it in, but it was like, it's not deliberately obtuse. It doesn't spoon feed you the plot because that's not the point. And if it's not, and if you don't enjoy it, that comic wasn't for you,
Also, I just want to say really quick, this person was a retailer, so they were like actively destroying their own property that they're supposed to sell and talking their own customers out of it, which is just bizarre.
It was a retailer and a comics journalist.
Oh, okay.
There was a comics journalist who had the retailer just done this thing where they tore up the issue in their store, it would not have been a thing had the journalist not then decided that this was a story. One of them's out of business and the other one has a day job, so we win.
There's one thing I wanted to bring up that I think is really interesting about your career. And it's one of those things where it's like, I kind of feel like you have to be somewhat deliberate to do it, but you also wouldn't have as much success at it if you didn't do it kind of organically. You are, I would say, maybe the best community builder in comics. And you look at like Bitch Planet. Mm-hmm. I mean, how many non-compliant tattoos are there? I mean, there's a lot. Yeah. People identify with that. There's the Carol Corps. There was like, I think I read somewhere that there was like after the movie came out for Captain Marvel, something like 10 times as many little girls were in your line at conventions.
Yeah.
I mean, you have Visible Women, something that you're actively using to help identify the great talents of women in comics and try to get them work. Not just like identify them, but also try to activate them.
Right.
And I think that that's one of those things that is like a real, it's an incredible thing that you've done. And it's interesting because, like I said, it's like, I don't know if you go in deliberately. I mean, Visible Women, obviously, you deliberately were building something there. But with the other ones, it's like, I don't know if you're going in and you're like, we're going to make so many tattoos with this NC design. But is that something that you actually, one other thing I want to bring up, Good Trouble Productions. Like that is another thing where you're deliberately going in with a mission built off of Congressman John Lewis's message and his dreams, and trying to do something with it. Is that something that you always want to be present in your work, is trying to do more than just tell a story, but also do something that is meaningful for the people who engage with it?
That is a hard question. Yes and no. It is absolutely deliberate, has absolutely been deliberate in like naming the Carol Corps and really trying to, with Bitch Planet in the backs of the individual issues, having what was essentially a feminist magazine that focused on trying to connect readers to each other, to consciously build community, or with Visible Women, which we have big plans for. There's a lot underway with Visible Women. And oddly enough, even though Good Trouble is the most overt mission-based, Good Trouble is nobody's day job. It's nobody's, I keep using the word day job. Why am I doing it's nobody's full-time job, right?
Right.
And so, and for anyone who doesn't know, Good Trouble is a partnership. It's myself, my husband, Matt Fraction, Andrew Iden, who co-wrote the Congressman John Lewis's comics with him, Bon Chignal, who is Andrew's best friend, Valentine DeLandro, and John Miles, the congressman's son. We are a collective, we are a corporation of some kind, but I tend not to pay too close of attention to the business parts of it, unfortunately. We are formed with the purpose of creating nonfiction comics and creative nonfiction comics that progress the congressman's vision of the beloved society. And we're going to change our name, I suspect, at some point, because as proud as we are to have had the congressman's blessing, which we were lucky enough to have, and we did work, you know, we produced with Abrams' Run, which you just pulled off your shelf there. We do want to make sure that, you know, he's not around anymore. And we want to make sure that we're not trading on his legacy. And so we're talking about like how we want to do that, how we want to handle that going forward. But anyway, even though that project is the most explicitly pro-social,
right,
it is the one where we've just been focused on the books. We haven't really been focused on community building or the really genius community building thing that Andrew and the congressman did was the march at the Children's March at San Diego. And that was before our company was formed. That was actually not long after that was when Andrew and brought the group of us together with the congressman so that we could figure out how to actually do this.
You have to help my memory on something. I swear to God, didn't you do like a Captain Marvel 5K or something like that? Wasn't there one? Or am I just losing my mind?
I didn't do a Captain Marvel 5K, but I have done some Disney Avengers stuff with Captain Marvel, and we've done various like fundraisers and walks and whatnot. But yeah, it was. I mean, at that time, it was a time when a lot of women were returning to reading comics, and these things come in waves, and we have a very short memory as a culture, and we think that like, oh my gosh, women are discovering comics, and like, you guys women have always read comics. Like, there was a time, the 80s and 90s, when for commercial reasons comics were being used to sell toys, and they were doing a lot of targeted marketing, so really focused on boys and men, and women were made to not feel so welcome for a whole slew of reasons. It was also, as comics were leaving public spaces and going into comic shops, and comic shops starting up, comics retailing starting up as ways where a lot of men were getting rid of their personal collections in these stores, and like a good handful of them were. It was also about getting rid of like their porn collections. I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
And so, they weren't always places that women felt particularly welcomed or invited and or safe. And so a lot of women stopped reading comics, but it wasn't as, I like to point out that there was a comics magazine called Calling All Girls that had a circulation of 500,000 a month in the 40s and 50s. Now, it was an entirely different marketplace at the time, but that was never chump change. And it was, specifically girls' comics. So this isn't new. But anyway, my incredibly rambling point being that when Carol Core was happening, I made a conscious decision to center female readers, and wanting it to be a thing where it's like, everybody is welcome to read this book, but I'm going to center you. And that doesn't mean that it's just like an anti-dude book. I have read books my whole life that centered the male reader, and I'm fine. So in doing that, we wanted to introduce women to other women who like this stuff in a way that helped them make friends and expand the community and feel safe making their own comics. And so that was conscious.
Right.
But like the NC tattoos, I don't know how that happened. They're not tattoos in the book. That's the funny.
They are now.
Everybody thinks that they're tattoos in the books. They're on the uniforms. No one in the book has an NC tattoo.
Still pretty cool, though.
Oh, no, it's amazing. I love it. I literally, at the dog park last night, met a woman who lifted up her sleeve and showed me her NC tattoo. It happens all the time. It is the most incredible experience. It has a lot to do, I think, with Valentine's eye for design, and the fact that that shape lends itself to a secondary expression. So people can use the NC, but then they put something else inside the NC. So you'll see identity flags inside the NC. I've seen Captain Marvel images inside the NC. I've seen one Pretty Deadly inside the NC, which is really cool. But, there's just like a lot of different ways that people can express themselves with that. And his eye for design, and then just needing to have something that said, this is who I am. I get it. I completely get it. And I absolutely love it. But that was not deliberate in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I mean, that goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning, right? Is like, once it's out of your hands, it becomes something else.
Yes.
And like the fans take it. I think one thing that's really cool that you're doing coming up is at Rose City Comic Con, you're doing the Wonder Woman Historia Amazon Warrior Walk, which is, and I quote, a celebration of cosplay and pageantry focused on interpreting the art and designs of Phil Jimenez, Gene Ha, and Nicholas Scott. And you'll be emceeing that. I mean, like those things, you're encouraging something that's already there.
Right.
Like all you're doing is like, I mean, I am like dying to see some of the cosplay that comes out of that, because first off, some of the stuff feels vaguely dangerous.
Oh yeah.
There are some pointy things that are going on where if I wore that, I would be bleeding very quickly.
I am terrified. And I am also terrified because we had a whole thing happen where we had this idea. So this comes from, I hate talking head panels. I hate them. And it may be, and I don't mean talking head comic book panels. I mean, when you go to a convention and it's
sure,
on a panel and it's, like, oh, I have a question. We're all going to go down the line and answer the question, right? Like
you and me both.
My ears bleed. I hate them when I'm on them. I hate going to see them. I feel like 99% of the time, all of the information that you might want, that you might get from that is available better in somebody's podcast, right? I've done several deep dive Historia podcasts, and there is a good chance whatever question you have about it is probably available in one of those. So if we're going to do a live event, I mean, and maybe this is my theater background, right? But if we're going to do a live event, let's do a live event, right? Let's make this something that, like, oh my God, I wish you were there. There's a reason to leave your house and come do this thing. So when we've done this in the past, the ones that, not this, because this is brand new, but when we've really tried to rethink how to do these panels in the past, Matt and I did things like the milk fed panels that we used to do at Heroes Con, where, we wrote a game show that was
awesome.
It was Ultron, Kanye, or Tallulah. And so we would read a line and you had to decide whether that line was something that Ultron said, something that Kanye West said, or something that our daughter said, who I think was like 4 at the time, right? And we had Kit was the milk-fed trash fairy, and she had this big trash bag full of prizes. And, if you participated, you got to pull a prize out of the trash fairy bag. And she had goofy wings. And we made it a thing that was that you had to be there for. And there was a panel that a group of us did at Dragon Con a few years ago. We'd been asked to do a women in comics panel, and we were like, oh God. And so we hijacked the panel, quote unquote. We got permission to do it first. I didn't want to
you took your own spin on it.
I didn't want to scare anybody or, endanger anybody's position or whatever, but we got permission to quote unquote hijack the panel, and we made it a men in comics panel. And so all of the women on the stage discussed men in comics and how we might make men feel safe in comics. And like, if your boyfriend wants to read comics, what's a comic that might be good for a dude? What comics do boys like? Right. And we took questions from people in the audience. And when the men would have questions, I would cut them off or ask them to turn around and show everybody their outfit and tell them how cute they were and ask them if they read comics or if they were new or, we basically just did an improv satire of a women in comics panel. And it was a blast. It was maybe the most fun I've ever had on a comics panel. So in our audience, their Dragon Con academic tract is so sharp. So there was a lot of enthusiasm. They played along. It was really, really fun. So when it was like, oh, we're going to do this Historia thing. Well, Historia is the most theatrical book I've ever had the chance to do. We can't just, what does Wonder Woman mean to you? What was the first time you remember seeing Wonder Woman? Like, oh my God, cut my throat.
I'm not a wrestling person. I've never been into pro wrestling and everything. But I've always kind of felt like panels should learn a little bit from wrestling. There needs to be spectacle and entertainment to it. Every time I go to one, I rarely go to them, to be honest. I went to a few the first time I went to Emerald City Comic Con, and afterwards I was just like, I don't think these are for me, which is fine. Some people like them, go to town. But I just feel like you can have so much more fun involved. I feel like the intros, I feel like people should walk on stage after being introduced at the very least. There needs to be some theatricality to it. But just a few more questions. I did want to ask involving Historia. I think one of the interesting things about this is going back to the test kitchen 3 times now.
Let me see if I can mention a day job.
The thing that's interesting about Historia is you were one of the very first Black Label projects. Like, it came out in 2021. It was announced in March 2018. Mark Doyle reached out to you in 2017. And so you were given this position where not only could you do your own story, but you could do it in a new format that we've never seen before, and you could do whatever you want. I mean, there was like a moment where you're like, should I do this about Nocturna? I don't know, maybe. But it is interesting to think about all that because it gives you so much freedom to build something different that isn't something like we've seen before, where you can kind of, I mean, one of the things I really like about Historia is that it simultaneously feels massive in scale and really small.
Mm.
You feel the characters, but also like sometimes like that Heracles page you talk about, or like the scale with like the gods and all dealing with everyone. I'm curious as to what that kind of, I don't want to say unfettered freedom, because I'm sure if Chris Conroy had a gun to his head, he could be like, well, there was a little fettering going on at some point. But what did you like? What did that offer you? Do you think that like this book could have been anything like itself if it existed within kind of traditional comic book archetypes? I know that's a lot. Sorry.
No, it's okay. So a lot of this is about Phil, because he was reticent to return. He had a bad experience with DC on, I mean, this is not, I'm not talking out of school. I can't remember what the book was. Have you had him on yet?
No, he declined initially too, right?
He did. So he had a bad experience. I'm not a fast writer. He is not a fast artist. And, comics are not, our first issue took 4 years, right? And comics are not made for that. You got to, this is a for-profit business. The train's got to leave the station every 30 days. Like, it's just, they never gave up on us, which is really unusual. And we have a lot of editors who were taking body blows, I'm sure, to protect us, to thank. So Andy Coury and Mark Doyle first out of the gate, and then Conroy and Andrea Shea later. It comes down to them really not rushing us, but also to Phil insisting that he would not be rushed, and thus I would not be rushed. And, I think financially that cost him quite a bit, but creatively it was such a gift to both of us to be like, nope, we're going to take our time with this. And, and the Nicola book, the section with the trans Amazon, I rewrote that scene top to bottom 3 times. You don't generally get to do that. And that made a huge difference. And, when you look at that first issue and you're like, well, that took 4 years to draw. I'm like, yeah, it did. Like, you can see every day of those 4 years on that page. And what you don't see is in the Hera spread, where he sent me 3 different pairs of shoes fully rendered. It was like, well, I can't decide what shoes she should be wearing here. And it was like, oh my God, or him insisting that every time Hera appears, she will have on a different gown, because of course she does. He's absolutely right, but it's not defensible in the normal model, and then like, God, poor Jean having to come in after that and draw the same costumes in a quarter of the time.
Gene is a Terminator, though. So
no, he is just the consummate professional. He's and an incredibly gracious human being as well. I'm very, very, very lucky with all 3 of them.
I just want to say that the backup, like the material in the back, listeners can't see this. So again, another great foray into audio stuff.
Yes.
But the back, there's a page or a double page spread that Nicola did that it just shows her art without colors. It's like an ink wash. I actually, if they want to get some more mileage out of Historia, I heartily support the idea of doing a black and white version of it, because I would die to see all of her washes, because that page is like even more stunning in black and white. It's like unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
What I want is, especially with the first issue, I want them done so that they're bound here. How would you describe this? Oh, double wide.
Yeah.
I don't want the seam down the center. I want a wide book that's bound here and opens so you can see. One of the problems with the binding is like there's a lot of compositions where there are faces in the middle that get cut into and it's going to be really painful when we do an oversized, like this is my fantasy, but if we get to all 9 issues, then we'll have a From Hell size book, but it'll be even bigger. It'll be page count of From Hell, but proportionately a larger page.
Damn, what would that be? Like 630 pages if it averaged out the same? A little bit more than that, maybe. That'd be a big one.
Yeah, it'd be huge. Be like brain somebody with it kind of book, which I enjoy. But if we do that, those center bindings on a couple of these compositions are going to be like incredibly painful.
Yeah. Well, last question for you. I actually wanted to ask about how you balance what you do, because you mentioned earlier, you have like Pretty Deadly coming back. You got Bitch Planet coming back, and you have a third creator-owned book you just signed up for. It's kind of interesting. My comp I always do is I always say it's kind of like George Clooney, where it's like, I'm going to do Syriana, and then I'm going to do like a big blockbuster, and then I'm going to do a Coen Brothers movie where I'm always an idiot, because that's what George Clooney does. And then I'm going to do another blockbuster. How do you figure out the right balance for this stuff? Because like coming off Historia, it makes sense to go there because you have, Eisner's and you have this like big passion for it. And it always seems like a lot of your, Pretty Deadly came on the heels of Captain Marvel launching. Mm-hmm. And then Bitch Planet kind of came after like Captain Marvel was really rising. And a lot of times like the best way to do it is to build off of something that's already a success to like kind of launch other things. How do you figure that out? Is it like very feel based, or is there like a deliberate balance you try to achieve between those two sides, like for hire versus creator owned?
No, it's pretty intuitive. I think that's true. So if you're doing work for hire books will build your audience for your creator owned books, because there are people who follow those characters, who will follow those characters no matter what. And if they like your writing, they will then check out your creator-owned books. And so it is a way of supporting your independent work and keeping your name on shelves. There's some part of it that is career management. That said, at this point in my career, I am not so much in the place where I'm worried about building. Now I'm more interested in who I have the opportunity to work with, and do I have something I really want to say. I've never taken a book where I didn't think I had a point of view. In the best example there is Aquaman. Brian Bendis was in the hospital. He was very, very ill, and Brian basically likes to talk about his family, movie, and work, like movies and work. And so we were just in the hospital trying to keep his spirits up. And we're like, he had just signed on with DC. And so we were talking about work just to try to cheer him up. And he was like, wouldn't it be fun if we got everybody together over at DC? And so we were kind of casting each other. And Brian said to me, like, you don't have any interest in Aquaman, do you? And I was, because it was like, well, it'll be Kel on Supergirl. And I was like, yeah, coming off of my run on Carol Danvers, I should absolutely write Kara Danvers. Like, that seems like a great idea, because what I haven't covered yet is very powerful blondes, right? Like, no. And so then he was like, well, you don't have any interest in Aquaman, do you? And I said, no. And then Matt was like, hang on. And he was like, Jason Momoa. And I was like, okay. And then it was like, well, what is Kel's take on Aquaman? And like, do you have thoughts about, he's a king. And like, we started riffing on it, and I was thinking about it. And then I think the thing that hooked it for me was I was trying to figure out if I could I link his gift to his wound in a way that felt poetic to me. And so I'm kind of going through all of his backstory and stuff, looking for like, all right, what's his wound? Where's the engine? And there was this, it's like, well, he killed Manta's father, and like, it's a little too dark for, like, he's a Blue Sky character. I don't really want that to be his thing. And then looking through some like, oh, is it like Superman where he is like, quote unquote, a fish out of water? Like, this is not his home. And, he's an alien and he loves them, but they don't accept him. Like, no, they totally accept him. He is like beloved. And also like he was raised in Amnesty Bay. If anything, he's a fish out of water in Atlantis,
Right.
like, and the joke I made is like, he has a dog. Wherever you have a dog, that's where you live, like, so he has a dog in Amnesty Bay. He's from Amnesty Bay. He's not, and he's like a local celebrity. It's not like they're like, oh, weirdo, But then I got to this bit where, his mom abandons him to return to her duties, and his dad takes him to the edge of the ocean every day to look for his mother who does not come. And I was like, well, that is child abuse, one. And two, there is a wound that can act like an engine. That is, the abandonment is an empty space, and abandonment by a mother is an incredibly empty space. And then it was like, okay, so can we connect that to his gift? Well, he has, all kinds of superpowers that are not particularly unique. He's extra strong, and he can breathe underwater. And, there are lots of people that can do all of those things. That the one ability that he has is very much unlike anything else is the telepathy. Like, it's the thing that gets mocked, right? You're the guy that can talk to fish.
Right.
Well, what if you're the guy who can call every creature in the ocean back to you except your mom? Right?
Yeah.
And then it was like, well, shit, now I have to write this.
I mean, going back to a word we used earlier about like, scripting and everything, it's like, it's squishy. It's like with your career, it's like you have to be, it's like you have plans, like, you want Pretty Deadly to come back, and you want Bitch Plant to come back. But sometimes it's like you got to be squishy about it. You got to be flexible, and you have to accept when you've been somehow incepted into writing Aquaman because you found a path to writing your version of Aquaman.
Right. And now you can't stop thinking about it. So now you're fucking pitching Aquaman, which you didn't need to do, Or yesterday, I'll be a little bit vague because I'm not sure what. Yesterday, we called a project I've been working on and off for a while that was supposed to happen yesterday. The publisher and I decided it's not going to happen. And that was painful. And I wasn't being told, I was being asked, did I want to continue with this? Or, because there was a change that gave me an opportunity to just say, we're not doing it. Or, some money had already been spent. Like, I could decide I wanted to keep going on it. They were invested in it, and they would continue to invest in it. And we decided, with everything that's on my plate right now, I'm good. And we're going to just let that one die. And that was a different kind of the same thing that you're talking about. Just like intuitively letting, like, understanding. I hate it. I hate not delivering a thing I said I was going to deliver. I hate not seeing that across the finish line. Parisian White is another, this is not Parisian White, but Parisian White is one that we announced that never came out. I haven't given up on that one yet.
I mean, how do you plan for AMC announcing it and then immediately like shuttering its own publishing division?
That's the second time, though. That book was announced prior to that at Image.
Mm-hmm.
And, so when the AMC thing happened, I said, can we please not announce this? Because I don't want to repeat. I want to just drop it like Beyonce when it's done. And they were like, no, we don't do things that way. And then they announced it and then shuttered like something like 2 days later. I was just like, are you kidding me? That book feels doomed sometimes, but
when it's Bill Sienkiewicz, you got to keep on trying, right?
No, I know. So that's such a dream.
Well, you have delivered on many dreams before now. I really hope we get to see it someday. But so far, you're making magic happen, Kelly Sue. So I just want to say thank you so much for coming on to talk about Wonder Woman Historia, your career, collaboration, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, David, you're so kind. I hope that we get to do this again.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Kelly Sue DeConnick. You can find DeConnick on social media at Kelly Sue and her work in Wonder Woman Historia, The Amazons. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman for editing this podcast. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at Sketch Comic, or following me at @SlicedFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Christina Merkler, Cancel Comics, Scott Place, Darcy Van Polgees, Kevin Bides, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sue DeConnick, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian, Matteo Ciccati, Chris Doré, Nir Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Jingo Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Damstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Van de Ven, Brian, Subman Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Misella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Choi, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shelby, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Nick Bennett, Birdcage Comics Cafe, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stefan Hall, Philip Myra, Chris Bachala, Torin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julia Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Carl McMahon, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Adam Highfield, Fiona Stables, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.